Good evening, members. Welcome to the Corporate Services Scrutiny Review Board, 11th of March. We've got, I think, quite a substantial item on the agenda. I'll just do introductions, if you please, for me, Dominic, and then...
Thank you, Chair. I'm Dominic Monaghan. I'm the Democratic Services Officer for this meeting. We also have Alex Huff, Lindsay Stevens, and Stephen Mason from Democratic Services, and Olu Idowu from Legal. The councillors on the call tonight are Councillor Adrian Pegg, Councillor Nawaz, Councillor Stanton, the Chair, Councillor Nater, Councillor McChrystal, and then presenting the report tonight we have Councillor Eldred. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Right, so this is the Gender Representation Task Group report. This report was...
sorry, Chair, if we just go through apologies and the minutes first. Cheers. Thanks.
Okay. Any apologies?
No, thanks.
Minutes of the previous meeting. Can I have a seconder, please?
Happy to second, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Stanton. Right, so the report on the Gender Representation Task Group report was formulated with members, and I think it's quite important to give this report a good airing. Councillor Eldred is leading on the report. It was put together by Councillor Holmes and Councillor Skelton. So, Councillor Eldred, if I pass this over to you, we haven't been through it, but I think it's very well put together, but please lead on it.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for reminding me that it's probably my last meeting. I shall try not to let that make me get emotional. I'm very sorry to be going, and I will miss you all. I do think, though, it's a little bit telling in terms of this report that I am the only woman on the call presenting to a bunch of fine gentlemen, I have to say, but all gentlemen nonetheless. So I think it's worth noting that, Chair, but thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present this evening. It's appreciated. And my first thank you. So this has been a bit of a labour of love over a number of years, which came from us passing a resolution at full council to establish a task force based on the information that was contained in a report conducted by the Fawcett Society about women in local government, about the challenges facing local government, and about the fact that local government representation of women in local government had not kept pace with representation of women in Parliament. In fact, it would take something like 80 years at the current pace of change in order to get equal representation of men and women in local government. So, and that was a report that was prepared by the Fawcett Society to commemorate 100 years of some women being able to vote in 2018, I think. Quite a long time ago. But so, firstly, I just want to thank the work on this as Councillor Nater has highlighted, has always been done on a cross-party basis, and Councillor Skelton and Councillor Alison Holmes and myself worked on this report, and I'd like to say thank you to both of them. It's been fantastic to have the opportunity to work with them, and it is always good that when you sometimes strip away the party politics and just get down to some of the nuts and bolts and get the opportunity to work with people on this kind of issue, it's appreciated. Thank you very much, Dominic, who particularly in the last year has kind of persevered in chasing us all. It's been very difficult to keep us all together over the last year in particular with everything else that's been going on, so thank you to him as well. So the recommendations, I'll try not to talk for too long, Chair, even though it is my last meeting and I could just like filibuster the whole thing. I'll just very briefly go through the recommendations. So we had a lot of conversations, we had a lot of exploration, and Dominic and other officers went away and did a lot of research for us based on the ideas we came up with. And I think what we've come up with is a good starting point in terms of how we as a council could work towards increasing representation of women. I'm not going to go into why we need to do that. It's very clear to all of us who either sit in the virtual chamber or who have sat in the real chamber that we are a very male-dominated council, and that we desperately need to have more women in place in order to be truly representative of the people of Derby. So I take that as a given, Chair, that we don't need to go through those arguments. So the first recommendation we came up with was around chairs and vice chairs, and trying to ensure that we have equal representation of men and women when those positions are filled. And the reason for that, Chair, is partly because once we get women into onto the council. We want to encourage them into leadership positions and give them the support that they need in order to take on those positions. But also there is something, Chair, about seeing yourself reflected. If you are a woman who is a citizen of Derby who's possibly contemplating the idea of becoming a councillor, I think you're much more likely to put yourself forward if you can see people who are visible and in positions of leadership that you can aspire to. So that is very important. So what we would like to do is ask council to ensure that when chairs and vice chair positions are being filled, that notice is given to gender representation of those positions, and that we try where we can to have equal representation. So that's the first recommendation. The second recommendation could be controversial, certainly for those of us who've claimed dependent carers allowance, which is the allowance you can claim if you do have to look after, if you have caring responsibilities, whether they be for children or parents or other people, and you need to claim for support with that caring whilst you are in meetings. I think there's still a little bit of stigma around this in terms of claiming it. I don't think that it's encouraged to claim this allowance, although it can make a huge difference in terms of people being able to be a counsellor and perform their duties. So not only do we feel that this allowance should be raised to reflect kind of the accurate costs of caring and the ability to access care, particularly when you're talking about accessing care at unusual times of the day, like evenings, where it's more difficult to get appropriate care should you need it, but also that members should be encouraged to claim dependent carers allowance, and we should remove that stigma, and we should make it absolutely clear that this is a vital part of the role and you should be encouraged to claim it if you need it. So that's the second recommendation, Chair. The third recommendation, I hope, is not controversial, which there should be a programme in place that resources from within the council should be dedicated to a programme that encourages more women to stand, whatever form that might take. It might mean taster days, it might mean shadowing counsellors, it might mean people going out into the community and talking to people about what the role of a counsellor is. That we should have a focused programme in place, Chair, that actually works to encourage us raising the profile of counsellors in general, but also encouraging more women to stand. The fourth recommendation is around allowances. I think the Fawcett Society report was very clear that the number of hours on average that a counsellor works are increasing and have increased over the last period of time, and that makes it more difficult for counsellors to work and undertake their duties, and this particularly can be a barrier to women, and there's some information in the report that women are more likely to say that the level of allowances are a barrier to them standing to be counsellors. And also, this is not just about people standing, it's about retaining women counsellors. If you look at the figures, even when we do get women counsellors to stand, they're less likely to stand for more than one term, and they're less likely to stay as counsellors. So this is also about retaining women counsellors as they transition to different stages in their lives, I guess would be the right way to describe it, Chair. So if we were to have an allowance that reflected the national minimum wage, that would take it, as you see in the report, to £11,336, and that is what we would recommend council raise the basic allowance to, which would support more women to be able to take on that role. The fifth recommendation, this is not something that we have any power over, Chair, but certainly personally, seeing as I became a counsellor in 2014, which was, I think, the year that Eric Pickles decided that we didn't deserve to have pensions anymore, I think that it's something that we should be lobbying for and encouraging. And again, this would disproportionately impact women. If you are in a role where you have no access to pension, I personally, for the last 7 years, have had no pension, no pension provision whatsoever. And yet I have often during that time been working more than full time as a counsellor and with other responsibilities within the council, such as cabinet member and committee chair, and obviously leader of the Labour group for a time. And that is something that should be rectified at a national level and something that we should be campaigning and lobbying for. And the final recommendation, now this is something that council has already agreed, that a parental and carers leave policy for councillors be implemented. At the moment, there is no provision in the council for people to take either parental or carers leave. And we also have no policy in Parliament. They have the policy of pairing. So if somebody goes off on maternity leave or they have a baby, then they can pair a vote with somebody, which means that they don't, their party doesn't miss out. We have no such provision, which means, I believe personally, I don't think I ever missed a council meeting even after the twins were born, which meant I probably attended some meetings in a pretty spaced out state, I would imagine. And although it was probably character building and good practice for Councillor Stanton to often have to hold a twin whilst I was in a meeting, Councillor Russell and Councillor Stanton quite often tag teamed and held a twin each whilst I was in a meeting. Ideally that would not have been the case, and I wouldn't have been changing the nappies of the twins on my office floor whilst I was a cabinet member when they were about 3 months old. And we would have a policy in place that allowed people to take parental and carers leave. So we have already agreed this is full council, I believe, but it's a case of implementing it and making it a priority. So thank you, Chair. Those are the recommendations. I am happy to take questions and be really interested to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Councillor Eldra. Well read and good report, like I said earlier on, put together. I'm going to open it up to the floor because I really do think people should make their thoughts be known and felt. Who's first? Jack, I can see you're itching.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I mean, firstly, thanks so much for the report, and I think there's a kind of sadness that this may be your last meeting, and this is the report. This is the very report that you're bringing, which is something that not just that you've absolutely championed in the Labour group, but across the council, and I wholeheartedly hope that all these recommendations are adopted. But also, it's kind of sad because I guess had some of these recommendations been adopted a while ago, then you may not have been leaving. I mean, I know there's a wider picture, stuff like that, but you almost actually a personification of the problem that's going on here, which is, we have only 11 out of 51 councillors. About 20% of our councillors are women in the city, where it should be 50%. And this year alone, we're from the Labour group alone, we're losing Councillor Eldra and Councillor Russell, who are two of the best councillors I've ever worked with, regardless of gender. And so I just think it's a loss to the city. And so on this, on a couple of the points, though, that's the homage finish. But on a couple of the points, and it is an incredibly important issue. And I'm not going to pull any punches as someone who's an outgoing councillor. Some of these things really need to be dealt with. There is a serious problem of representation and getting not just the right people and the right representation, but also the right caliber of councillors. We don't just want, we want the best people for the job, and some of the conditions in which we make councillors, work is preventing that and preventing talented, potential brilliant councillors, particularly women, from considering that. I absolutely, in specific reference to the recommendations, I think the carers allowance, fantastic. I also think that there needs to be particular reference made to the flexibility of that carers allowance and the type of and how that is two things. One, how that's administered. So there is a flexibility given because you're not always sure how long you're going to be in a meeting. And so you can't always get a particular type of care. It has to be incredibly flexible. And secondly, is where we can't give a certainty around meetings, maybe we do have a bit of actually, people with a care responsibility can't just suspend standing orders and sit into the night. Maybe that's not an appropriate thing to do. Maybe actually we do say, no, if the meeting finishes at 10, it finishes at 10. That's more important than us sitting into the night and hearing, the 10th contributor on a particular motion. I mean, I've been that contributor, so this is, so I think that's incredibly important. And, I'm really with you with the pensions. The only thing I would append to the recommendation that we write to the government is I also think that potentially we write to the LGA, because I think that they should really be championing this. And as from a cross-party perspective, councillors are left pensionless, giving a level of service to the city. And at the end of it all, at a time when we're trying to encourage people to have contributions to their pension and workplace pension schemes across the board, we're actually asking people to pay a participating role in local politics, yet also at the same time denying them the basic right to be able to contribute to a pension. And that's a serious barrier to a lot of people. I think on the allowance, I think, I can happily say this because I'm outgoing and so I won't be in receipt of this allowance. Of course it's too low. And actually the very words that we say, oh, this brings it in line with the national minimum wage. The fact that we perceive the role of a councillor plays is of the minimum level of payable work. That's what we're actually saying there. Now, obviously, people may have all sorts of views of the quality of their councillor, but I think we actually, particularly where councillors have responsibilities and, whether it's special responsibility allowances or whatever it might be, it needs to be looked at. And where we want, particularly things like cabinet positions, really, areas where we really need people's full attention and we need a huge level of commitment, then that should be remunerated appropriately. You can't ask someone to basically keep their eye on multi-million-pound budgets and projects and everything else and deemed to be responsible, at least democratically, for those projects, and yet say you'll have to fit it in and around a full-time job or whatever that might be. So then there needs to be looking at that. So I absolutely support that. And I think in terms of the, I think that there also needs to be more done, maybe I think the campaign to encourage more women to go into local politics. I think the parties can do something, and I know that the Labour Party does. It's not always incredibly effective. I think sometimes we get these things wrong, but I do think there's also a role of the council to play there and to shine a light on female councillors. I think, and having those councillors as in positions of power, not just gives them, gives a potential female candidates something to aspire to, but also builds that body of experience. So when you do arrive in the council chamber, there are these women who have been there and done that and can guide you through that and be mentors. And so I think it's incredibly important. I don't think there's anything within this report I disagree with at all, and I just really fantastic that this is something that will be going to council as your final hurrah, as it were, Lisa. So really proud of that. Well done.
Thank you, Councillor Stanton. Well said. Councillor Nawaz or Councillor Pegg?
No comment, Joe.
Yeah.
Everything's okay. Really support it. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for everything you've done in this report. It's brilliant. Thanks.
Councillor McChrystal.
You call my name, but not had a chance to speak yet. Can I chip in?
Yes, yes, please do.
First, I want to thank Lisa, Alison and Ruth for the hard work that must have gone into this. It must have been quite a task. A couple of questions or points. I mean, I agree. I mean, in a wider aspect, I agree we've got to improve diversity, full stop, and gender specifically. Because I've been involved in politics for a few years, and we've often had discussions about how we increase diversity and gender, but no one seems to have a magic wand of how we go about it. And I'll be very interested to hear how Lisa thinks we could, what could be done to attract, more women and more diverse people into politics in general, let alone into the standing for the council. I would have a brief comment about suggested allowance increase, which I'm technically not against, but I'm a bit concerned about the timing of it, considering we're still going through the pandemic and there's a lot of hardship out there. Would it, would in effect yourself a pay rise, whilst it would encourage probably other people to take part, is the timing just quite not right? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pegg. Councillor Eldred, would you just like to get back to Councillor Pegg on that? I think it's a very valid question, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Pegg. I think there is no magic wand, I think, is the answer. And I think what you have to do is have a focused, targeted effort in order to, try and encourage and work alongside women and make sure that you've got processes and policies in place that will support them. And I think the measures in this report will go some way to do that. I also I mean, you know, I'm outgoing as well, so I don't need to kind of, you know, pull any punches. I do think that there is still a very combative element of local politics. The chamber can be very combative, and I think that can be very off-putting. I think there needs to be less discourse, more discourse and less combat. And actually, you know, I think we need to be very careful of the way that we behave as councillors. I have witnessed behaviour in the chamber which I would not consider to be inclusive towards a diverse range of people, Councillor Pegg. So I do think that the equality and diversity training that people have attended over the last few months, which was also something that you know, is pushed, and our behaviour as councillors is something that we need to watch. And certainly I have been certainly had sexist comments and sexist behaviour directed at me, and I know that other members of the chamber have also had inappropriate behaviour or experienced inappropriate behaviour either in the chamber, on social media, and in a range of forums. So I think we need to hold ourselves up as examples, Councillor Pegg, and make sure that we're all behaving appropriately and inclusively. In terms of the timing of the pay rise, I know that in an authority where we have elections every year, don't get me started on that, there's always going to be an issue in terms of councillor allowances. My view personally is that councillors should not be voting for their own allowances. MPs no longer vote on their own pay increases. That's done independently. They don't make those decisions. The fact that councillors have to do that is wrong, in my opinion. But what I would say to challenge back is that given the recovery that is going to be needed from this pandemic, and given the effort that this council is going to have to make over the next few years, and the investment that will be needed to ensure we have a good recovery from this pandemic, you blinking well want really good, high quality councillors in that chamber. And one of the ways to get that is to make sure that you remunerate them appropriately, as Councillor Stanton said. So in some ways, I think there's an argument to say we want to attract the right people over the next few years, because the job of a councillor is not going to get any easier, and it's certainly going to be very, very important. If I was being cheeky as well, Councillor Pegg, one of the things, and I don't know if you could do this, Dominic would have to check it out for us, one thing you could do is you could say that that this pay increase, if you call it a pay increase, doesn't actually, is not for existing councillors, it's for new people coming in, and then you're not voting for yourself to have a pay rise, you're voting for the people who come into the chamber who follow you to have that pay rise. So that might be something that's worth considering. I hope that answers your questions.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah.
Right, thank you for that, Councillor Eldrick. Councillor McChrystal.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and apologies for the lack of video. If I turn my video on, I'll probably lose internet connection. But yeah, I welcome the report. It's a super interesting read. So thank you for that, and thank you for the comments so far. I think we need to be minded that what is a councillor? Is it a job? Do we receive remuneration, or do we receive an allowance? And possibly there needs to be a change in terminology if we're going to truly look at this issue. Now, I have made some points, and I absolutely, firstly, secondly, I'd like to say is, you know, I'm clearly from a political party that absolutely welcomes diversity. And actively encourages diversity, and certainly locally in Derby City, we do everything we can to encourage as many people to come forward from as many different backgrounds as we can to look to stand to represent Derby City. But just on the 2.1, the nominations of chairs and vice chairs of committees, it's not really a function of council officers. It's for individual groups and groups to have responsibility for their own nominations, and then consequently voted on at the annual general meeting by members. And unfortunately, the last AGM we did lose a couple of women from chairs and vice chairs. I think it'd be very difficult to dictate who should be a chair based on gender, or who shouldn't be based on gender. And I think it's very much the responsibility for individual groups to put forward their own nominations and recommendations for those posts based on competency, and also based on their own personal situation as well. As I know, there are some positions as chair or vice chair that take more time than others, and not everybody is able to commit to that particular role. Also on 2.2, the dependent carers allowance, and again, I think there's very much a stigma for councillors to claim anything other than their basic allowance. In fact, I don't know any councillor, not that I've done any due diligence on it, but any councillor I personally know that actually claims anything other than their basic allowance or their SRA. And I think it's very much for individual parties and individual councillors, and I think as collectively, as a city, as a group of councillors, we need to remove that stigma, firstly, from claiming any form of allowance above and beyond the basic allowance. 2.3, and again, I don't really think this is a function of the council to solicit applicants of gender to political parties. It's very much for the individual political parties to seek nominations themselves. And I'm sure I speak for all political parties. It would be great if we had a raft of people coming forward to stand. I don't think there's any political party that is in that situation. So I think it's more so a question of, as Councillor Stanton said, how do we actually raise the bar and encourage a bigger cohort of people looking to become councillors, within the UK, but obviously specifically we're talking about Derby City. And then 2.4, and I think Dominic wants to touch on this, is the allowance, the basic allowance of members, and that's very much the responsibility of the IRP, who produce a report annually, which is voted upon by full council. I'm aware that the IRP for Derby is currently looking at the basic allowance for councillors, and have sought evidence of recent past as to views from prospective political groups. And that's the body that's really the task force to addressing the question of councillor allowance. Now, I used to think councillors, they shouldn't be paid, and then I read economics at university, and now I'm very much of the opinion, well, the more you actually offer in terms of allowance, it tends to be the larger pool of potential applicants you have to choose from as a political party or a political group, and consequently, I'm strongly of the belief that it will probably and hopefully raise the bar of potential councillors we have in the city by improving the allowance, which obviously isn't a remuneration. Now, 2.5. Now, I'm aware that I think Councillor Eldridge was right. 2014, the pension was withdrawn. It may well be an example to increase and help female representation to give a pension. It also, to be honest, might improve the calibre, full stop, of possible candidate coming forward. But then we're looking at a shift of, in terms of our language, is being a councillor a job, as in what you are receiving is remuneration, or are we receiving an allowance? And I think, a blunt recommendation of the paper to write to government for reintroduction without reasoning, I think would need to put some very, very strong reasonings, which would be evidence and fact-based, on how that is absolutely going to be the benefit to local and good governance. 2.6, I think the issue has been raised previously, again, about not gender specific, but councillors are not elected and are not employed, therefore, councillors are elected, not employed, therefore hours and days of work are non-specific. And I think we all know we have far too many councillors currently in Derby City that do absolutely nothing. They do the bare minimum. They will turn up to full council meetings. They won't stay to the end. We have councillors that don't take the share of positions on the various different scrutinies and committees that we're on. We have some councillors that sit on none. And I certainly sense in my short time as being a councillor the workload and the distribution of workload amongst councillors is extremely unfair, whether male or female. And I would suggest somehow that needs to be addressed in the first instance. And then 4.3, 4.4, you know, super useful, but again, I think it's really very much down to the independent review panel. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Chair, I'm about done. So sorry for the ramble, but I'm open to take any questions on what I've just spoken about.
Just, if I may, Chair, and it's just, I agree with certainly some elements of what Councillor McChrystal has said. I do think that, you know, I understand that being a councillor is not a job, but there's amazing amount of things that we seem to class in this country as not a job. Being a parent is not a job, and yet it actually is economically beneficial to the society. Being a carer is not a job unless you're paid. You know, there's loads of work that is done in this country that actually delivers an awful lot of value and keeps this country going, and yet we sort of strike a line of this is not a job because you don't have a punch card and you don't turn up at 9 and leave at 5 and gather. So I think actually that I agree with what you've said, which is being a councillor is not a job. But I think that is exactly the thing we need to be challenging and saying, well, it takes up time, it takes up effort, it takes up, you know, dedication. You know, I mean, I've never had a non-job like it where I've worn quite so much high vis, done quite as much litter picking, sat in quite as many meetings, and all of this, and that's not a job. So if it's not a job, I don't quite know what it is. So I think we do need to, I know the language can mean one thing or another, but for that much effort and that much dedication, you know, I think it should be encouraged that that councils get a pension. And I do think that the allowance or the remuneration, or however we describe it, should be adequate for the work done. I think to your point in terms of, yeah, it may be a really, really fair allowance for councillors who do nothing. I'm sure if you looked on actually how much each council was paid per hour, there would be a huge differential. But I think that's something that we solve through different means. And I think that should be called out. You know, I mean, if we see the attendance of councillors at meetings, or indeed in a ward level, if they're not picking up their casework, I think there does need to be means by which pointing out where councillors are probably not pulling their weight. But I've also worked with some incredibly dedicated and hard-working councillors who I know are fantastic value for money for this city, and you know, well over what they get in their allowance. So, but that's it. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor McChrystal.
Chair, I think you might be muted.
Chair.
Best phrases of this 12 months, isn't it? Everybody gets caught. Right, thank you, Alex. I've got Alex here. I just want him to go through the findings and reports of the IRP, and then I'm going to get Ola to have a look at the financial implications, and then we'll look at the recommendations, what we can put forward. I think we'll have a better idea when our two speakers, our colleagues, have sort of told us what they want to. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. And firstly, can I just say, I think as an officer cohort, we also really welcome this report. It's something that we were that I personally was involved with back in 2017 when we first started on this rather lengthy journey, and I think, you know, it's very much in the interests of the council to have a representative cohort of councillors that reflects the city. So it's really good to see this report coming to the committee. As mentioned by a few of the contributors, obviously there is a role, a statutory role of the Independent Remuneration Panel, or IRP, in setting the level of not setting the level of allowances, recommending a level of allowances that councillors should receive. The first point, I think it was mentioned earlier, that we could have some sort of differential between different councillors in terms of the level of basic allowance that could be received. Unfortunately, that's not permitted under the legislation. Secondly, Councillors will be aware that the IRP, generally speaking, although we consider a report once a year to approve a scheme of allowances, the IRP undertakes a more thorough review roughly every 4 years. And the panel have, as councillors will be aware, have been undertaking their most recent review since about autumn of last year. And they put out a call for evidence in September to councillors and also officers, asking for various contributions, and have spoken to a number of group leaders and other councillors with certain responsibilities over the last sort of 8 months. In that call to evidence, a key feature of that call to evidence was how can the members' allowances scheme be leveraged, as it were, to encourage a greater degree of representation and diversity, both in terms of gender, but also for people who are in full-time employment, for people with caring responsibilities, etc. And so I think I wouldn't be breaking any confidences of the panel to say that a lot of what is contained within these recommendations in this report will be reflected in the report of the IRP when it is presented to council. I don't think we're too far away from that point. I think we could probably expect a report in either May or July, but I think if the recommendations were to be carried as written, I think there is a risk that we preempt the report of the IRP. And what I would perhaps encourage the committee to consider will be to consider these recommendations alongside the report of the IRP, so they can be taken to council at the same time. My colleague Olu may have some views on that in terms of legality and decision making, but that would be my suggestion. And similarly, just to address comments about the specific role of the IRP, Council has a statutory duty to have regard for the views of an IRP when setting a scheme of allowances. That doesn't necessarily mean that recommendations have to be accepted, and any councillor who has been a member of this authority for some years will know that previous IRPs have consistently recommended increases in allowances. And because of the challenges that exist, I suppose, politically in agreeing increases to allowances in an authority that operates elections by thirds, those increases have not been accepted. So that there is a sort of longer term context that the chair of the IRP in particular, but also the other members are acutely aware of. And I think that when their report is presented to council, councillors will see quite a lot of parallels with the information that's contained within this report and the recommendations as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Alex. Right, I'd just like to say on that, Alex, the IRP have always brought us annual reports down, and I really find it difficult sometimes. The amount of level of work that they've put in, time and time again. And, you know, we as councillors reject it every time. Now, you know, these people give up their time to have a look at the overall sort of package and various other things of what councillors and what's happening in the council or the bodies. I think, you know, I know some of the people on that panel have been disappointed in the past when we've rejected them also. And I think it does need looking at, and I'm glad we've got an independent body that's looking at it. So let's ask Olu on the financial implications of that, and you know, where we stand with it. Olu.
Just coming in, just trying to get my camera on. There we go. Thank you, Chair. Chair, can I just clarify initially, in terms of the financial implications, in what context do you want in some clarification from me?
Well, I think it just came in as, you know, I mean, if we have a look at the current allowance, Olu, and what the increase means in terms of annually, I think it's pounds, if I'm correct. So if you just have a look at that and how it would sit with the council's budget, in terms of if these recommendations were put forward to us, we would need to sort of say that the council's budget is going to be X amount. That's where the money's coming from. Just that sort of background in general, so people are aware, and members, that you know, we've thought about the financial implications.
I think again, Chair, that in real terms, that to me would appear to be perhaps part of the hang-ups which the groups over the years have tended to have in finding difficulty with the IRP recommendations, as Alex has already alluded to. I think ultimately, if the IRP recommends it, then there'll have to be that consideration by the accountants, the Director of Finance in Section 151, about how to balance the books to reflect the need to uplift. As you rightly say, when you look at the differential between what I understand is currently paid at the basic level and what it's been asked to be, what's been recommended it should be moved up to, it doesn't appear to be much in real terms. I think it's more from the political perspective, it's about the perception. I think it creates, that's more the hang-up necessarily, in my view, rather more so than whether or not it's financially acceptable. I don't think it's going to amount to much. That's the long and short of what I'm saying. In terms of other legal points to pick up on, Alex has already talked about the tiered system effectively not being acceptable, not being lawful, and I think that will definitely create an issue going forward as well. But again, and the other point which Alex also touched on was the need to have regard. That is one of those phrases which lawyers bandy about. Having regard is one of those nebulous concepts. Ultimately, I think the long and short of what Alex has suggested makes a sense to me, which is that this report and its recommendations are considered alongside the IRP recommendations in due course. And there's one other reason why I think that's important to bear in mind, because ultimately, let's assume that the recommendations are put to council before the IRP report comes out. Council comprises of all 51 members, and based on the history of voting on IRP recommendations in the past, where council, prior to the IRP report, to support all of the proposals, and then you end up with the same sort of situation you've had in previous years. That's almost like a complete about turn from what council's recommendations would have been in relation to this as a standalone report. So I think it makes a lot of sense to have the two aligned and considered at the same time.
Okay, Olive, thank you for that. Councillor Eldred, you wish to speak?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thanks, Olu, and thanks, Alex, for that. That makes a lot of sense. I know I'm being cheeky. What I will say, Alex, is that although it might be unlawful to set that there is a differential in terms of councillors. Councillors don't have to take any or all of their allowance, so it is possible for individual councillors to say that, you know, in order to demonstrate that I'm not a turkey vote for Christmas, but you know what I mean, that I won't take this portion. But just in terms of the alongside the IRP, absolutely that makes sense, but presumably that only applies to the dependent carer allowance and the rise in the basic allowance. The other recommendations which don't have financial implications and don't kind of sit along the side the IRP process could be considered independently of that. Is that correct, Alex?
I think that the IRP have taken a very broad approach to their remit this time, and I think that actually all of the things that are in those recommendations will be captured to some extent in their report. I think the only thing that doesn't necessarily appear would be the reference to the pensions, because obviously that was, you know, removed a few years ago now. So I think subject to what the committee agrees, I think there is a mechanism by which if the committee is minded to pass to carry all of the recommendations, that they could all be considered as one, or alternatively separately if they could be voted on separately when they're presented to council, if that makes sense. So it's not all or nothing, as it were.
Thanks, Alex. Do you want to add anything to that, Lisa? I mean, I think with the IRP currently carrying out a review, other than that of the pensions, which we can act on, would it be worth for members to say we wait for their report to come through before we vote on it? Jack?
Well, I mean, my personal, I won't be voting on it either way, but so I think we could send the elements that are linked to the IRP. We could put a hold on those, but we could put forward anything that we think sits outside the remit of the IRP and send them forward to council independently and say, but also on the proviso, I also don't want to have it lost that if the IRP doesn't touch on any of these recommendations, that this committee would revisit that and then send these recommendations. We don't want anything missed here. And so I'm happy not to crowd out the IRP in their remit, but also I don't want the value of this report to be lost because we're waiting on something else. We do have a habit of doing that.
I totally agree with you. Councillor Eldred, would you like to have a final comment on that? What's your thoughts on it?
No, I think that, the conversation has been really helpful and interesting, and thank you for the demonstration of support. It is really important, I think, that we carry this work forward, and I think it's just actually genuinely important that we're having this conversation, and that we're not hiding and pretending that there isn't an issue that needs to be addressed. And it is refreshing to see members from different political parties acknowledging that challenge and wanting to do something about it. So thank you, Chair. Again, thank you for the opportunity to come and speak, and I hope that these recommendations go through council. I also won't get the opportunity to vote on them, which is a shame. But
right, Alex wants to make a comment. Alex.
Sorry, Chair. I just wanted to clarify what I said earlier. I mean, it's entirely at your discretion as a committee, but I wouldn't necessarily suggest you need to wait on voting on them. All I would recommend is that the recommendations are, whichever recommendations you wish to agree, are agreed subject to the receipt of the IRP, and that way it allows us to feed them into council around the same time or to be considered alongside one another.
Right, okay, thanks for that, Alex. So, well, let's take it as it is then. We've got, so 2.1, I suppose we could put that recommendation forward if people are in agreement of that. That's outside the IRP. Is that okay with members?
Well, I'm not okay with that. I think it's very much for, as I said in what I discussed, that it's very much for groups to make their own individual nominations to be voted on the annual general meeting. Okay.
I think we best sort of just carry out a vote for that then, just to make sure we've got it right. Is that all right, Alex?
Sorry, Chair. Yes, absolutely. I think Dom's available to conduct a vote if you wish.
Yes, please. Let's do it right, so it's on record.
So we're voting on recommendation 2.1 in the report, which is to recommend to council that Derby City Council should aspire to achieve equal gender representation when filling chair and vice chair positions, and that all reasonable steps must be taken to achieve this. So, Councillor Adrian Pegg, please.
Against.
Thank you. Councillor Nawaz, please.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Stanton, please.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Nater, please.
For.
Thank you. And Councillor McChrystal, please.
Against.
Right, so that recommendation's carried, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. 2.2, recommend to dependents carers allowance. I understand the IRP will be looking at that.
That's correct, Chair, but I obviously can't preempt what the report will say. So, as I suggested, perhaps you might wish to consider agreeing the recommendation subject to receipt of the report of the IRP.
I would be happy with that as well. If members, can we just do another vote on that based on that we can agree with it pending the recommendation of the IRP?
Chair, it may speak too much slightly. I guess we'll go down the list, and if there is anyone who is against the recommendation, then that will trigger a vote. If not, then we'll just pass them through. Is that
okay? Thank you for that. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, I agree what Jack is saying. I think that's the better way to do it.
2.2. Anybody against?
Like I said, I mean, I think this is something which is the individual group's responsibility to advise its members accordingly. And I sort of stick by that. So yeah, I'm not necessarily in agreement with 2.2 as a recommendation.
Okay, then, Dominic, we'll have to go on the vote for that.
Okay, so we're voting on 2.2 to recommend to Council that the dependent carers allowance be raised and that Derby City Council recognise the importance of a dependent carers allowance and encourages members to use this, and that will be considered alongside the IRP report.
That's correct.
Okay, so Councillor Adrian Pegg, please.
4.
Thank you. Councillor Nawaz, please.
4.
Thank you. Councillor Stanton, please.
4.
Thank you. Councillor Nater, please.
4.
Thank you. And Councillor McChrystal, please.
Against.
Thank you. So that vote is carried, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, 2.3, we can go vote on that. I think Councillor McChrystal again did make his comments known. Is that still the case, Councillor McChrystal?
Yes, it certainly is, Chair.
Okay, that's fine. Can we take that to the vote as well, Dominic?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. So that's recommendation 2.3 to recommend to Council that a programme be introduced to encourage more women to stand for all political parties. Councillor Adrian Pegg, please.
4.
Thank you. Councillor Nawaz, please.
4.
Thank you. Councillor Stanton, please.
4.
Thank you. Councillor Nater, please.
4.
Thank you. And Councillor McChrystal, please.
4.
Thank you. So that recommendation's carried, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 2.4, we'll defer that to the IRP, if that's okay. Anybody against that? Okay, carried. We'll refer that. 2.5, to recommend the Council writes to the Government to recommend that pensions for councillors be introduced. Now, I personally do feel very strongly about that, and I think, as Councillor Stanton, has sort of, and Councillor Eldred as well, I think this is one of the biggest sort of downfalls of attracting people, families and so on, that we encourage as council and as a country to encourage people to be on the pension sort of ladder, and yet we're the people that are not getting it, and councils are not putting forward members for the pension. So I personally do agree with what's been said earlier. So can I just take a bit of advice on this one, Alex? Can we put this forward subject to the IRP recommendations as well?
I don't necessarily think this is one of the recommendations that needs to be subject to the receipt of the IRP. It's not something that's directly within their remit. Obviously, as a scrutiny board, you are entitled to recommend to council that they contact the government or the LGA with regards to pensions for councillors. Equally, you don't necessarily need to make the recommendation to council. You could write as a scrutiny board to the government. Obviously, if you were to refer it to council and council agreed it perhaps would carry more political weight, but that is entirely at your discretion as a board.
Okay, then what I suggest on that, we write both to the council to recommend that, and also, as Jack suggested, to the LGA, a bigger wider campaign, and hopefully they can sort of go across other councils and make this an issue worth sort of looking into. If any members against that? No, I think we're okay with that then, Dominic.
Yep.
So we're writing to council and to the LGA for them to campaign on the pension rights. 2.6, to recommend council that a parental and carers leave policy for councillors to be implemented. Anybody against that? Nobody's against that, Dominic, so that's carried.
Chair, just on that, I seem to recall that Councillor Eldred seemed to suggest that this has since been approved by Council already.
Yes.
If it has, then I think that potentially makes that particular recommendation superfluous.
Yes,
I think,
it does.
sorry, I think, Olu, the point was that it has been. I think it has been. I think it's never been implemented. So I think what it is it's saying to council this needs to be implemented. I think it was agreed that it would be looked at, and it was agreed that it should be. But this is about saying it should now be put in place. If that makes sense. That's...
Right. I see. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you for that, Councillor Eldred. So yes, let's reaffirm that and let's put it into practice. Okay, is that all of them? Support. Right, anybody else want to comment on those? Any more comments? No? Right, on a final note, I'd just like to thank Jack and Lisa. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure working with you. And, you know, the council is losing two great councillors. And Lisa, you've done a lot for, well, the council as a whole, and for the rights of people as well, stuck up for him. And I've already blown Jack's bubble out. He's awesome, I think. So I wish you luck in whatever you're doing, and look after your families and be good, and hope to see you back sometime in the future. I'll probably be retired by then.
You'll still be here, Joe.
I don't know.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you. That's very, very kind. It's been a pleasure working with you as well.
You're welcome. Members, thank you very much, and officers, thank you for your time, and I wish you good night. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, councillors. Thank you, Chair.
Bye.